She built the coffee shop with her own hands. She even married the most feared man in Chicago. And then she unknowingly hired the woman who would destroy her marriage from inside her own business. This isn't a story about love gone wrong. It's about power, betrayal, and how one small decision can bring an empire to its knees. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, if you've ever been betrayed by someone close, then this story is for you. Before we begin, subscribe if you believe karma always collects. Like this video to support real, raw storytelling, and comment where you're watching from, because this story reaches every corner of the world. Now, let me take you to Chicago. The bell above the door of Edith's Brew rang nonstop on weekday mornings, a steady rhythm that matched the hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of conversation. The shop sat on a corner in downtown Chicago, where steel towers cast long shadows and ambition moved faster than traffic. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans, cinnamon, and quiet authority. Edith Shade stood behind the counter, tablet in hand, scanning inventory while greeting customers by name. She wore tailored slacks and a cream blouse, her posture calm, controlled, someone who knew exactly what she had built and how to protect it. To the left, two construction workers argued over fantasy football. To the right, a young mother rocked a stroller while sipping a latte. And in the back booth, men with expensive suits and dangerous reputations spoke softly, eyes always watching. This balance was no accident. Edith had built the shop 12 years earlier, long before she ever met John Shade. She drained her savings, signed risky leases, and worked 16-hour days until the business finally turned a profit. The shop was hers, legally, financially, completely. John entered her life later. John Shade was a third-generation mafia boss, a name spoken carefully across Chicago. He ruled his world with discipline and silence, commanding loyalty through fear and legacy. When he married Edith, they made an unspoken agreement. She would never ask about his business, and he would never interfere with hers. For 12 years, it worked. That morning, John sat in his usual back booth, black coffee untouched, eyes scanning the room like it belonged to him. Edith brought his cup herself. Their exchange was polite, restrained, two professionals sharing space, not affection. It was a balance built on distance. As the rush slowed, Edith stepped to the front window and taped up a simple sign, "Help Wanted." She smoothed the paper flat, unaware that this small decision had just invited ruin through her front door. The bell above the door chimed at precisely 2 o'clock, and Edith looked up from the espresso machine to see a young woman stepping into Edith's brew with the kind of careful grace that suggested she knew how to make an entrance. Honey blonde hair cascaded past her shoulders in loose waves that caught the afternoon light streaming through the storefront windows. She wore a simple cream blouse and dark jeans, nothing flashy, but somehow she still managed to command attention. When she approached the counter, her smile was warm and disarming. "Hi there," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable lilt of the Deep South. "I'm here about the waitress position. I saw your posting online." "Sharon Barnes?" Edith asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, ma'am." The accent wrapped around the words like honey. Georgia, Edith thought. Maybe Atlanta. Edith gestured toward one of the corner booths, away from the handful of afternoon customers. "Let's talk." As they settled across from each other, Edith studied the young woman. Mid-20s, probably. There was something both vulnerable and resilient in her hazel eyes, like someone who'd learned to smile through disappointment. "Tell me about yourself," Edith prompted. Sharon's fingers traced the rim of the water glass Edith had brought over. "Well, I just moved here from Atlanta about 3 weeks ago. Needed a fresh start, you know?" She laughed, but it carried a note of genuine pain. Had a bad breakup, one of those situations where staying in the same city just wasn't an option anymore. Edith nodded, her compassionate instincts immediately engaged. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult. It was, Sharon admitted, meeting Edith's eyes with what appeared to be complete honesty. But Chicago feels like a place where I can rebuild, start over. I've been waitressing since I was 16, worked my way through community college doing it. I'm good with people, I learn fast, and I show up when I say I will. There was something earnest in her voice that Edith found instantly likable. She asked a few more questions about Sharon's experience, her availability, her expectations. With each answer, Edith became more convinced that this young woman was exactly what the shop needed. Someone with hustle, personality, and that undefinable quality that made customers feel welcomed. When can you start? Edith asked. Sharon's face lit up. Tomorrow? Today? Whenever you need me, honestly. Edith laughed. How about tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock? We'll get you trained on the basics. Thank you so much, Mrs. Shade. Sharon reached across the table and squeezed Edith's hand. You have no idea how much this means to me. Sharon's first week exceeded every expectation. She absorbed information like a sponge, memorizing the menu by day 2 and learning the regulars' names by day 3. She had an easy rapport with customers, making the elderly men from the neighborhood smile and charming the morning business crowd with efficient service and genuine warmth. Carlos Mendoza, the veteran barista who'd been with Edith since the shop opened, pulled her aside on Wednesday morning. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and hands that could create latte art blindfolded, Carlos had seen plenty of staff come and go. The new girl's good, he said, nodding toward Sharon as she laughed at something a customer had said. Real natural. Haven't had to correct her once. Amy Chen, the 19-year-old cashier who worked afternoons while attending community college, was equally enthusiastic. She's been helping me with my customer service voice. She says I need to smile more with my eyes, not just my mouth. It's actually working. My tips are up. Edith watched Sharon move through the shop with growing satisfaction. This was what she loved about her business, giving people opportunities, watching them flourish. Sharon reminded her of herself at that age, determined, a little wounded, but refusing to let circumstances define her future. On Friday afternoon, John came in for his weekly visit. He'd been doing this for years, stopping by around 3 o'clock when the shop was at its quietest, sitting in his usual back corner booth, conducting the occasional phone call while nursing a black coffee. It was one of the few moments where the barrier between their two worlds became permeable. Sharon had just finished wiping down the counter when John walked through the door. Edith saw Sharon's posture straighten slightly, that subtle shift women make when they register an attractive man entering their space. John Shade, at 45, was still commanding, 6'2", with dark hair graying at the temples, and the kind of presence that made people unconsciously step aside. Your usual, Mr. Shade? Edith called from behind the espresso machine. Please, John said, heading for his booth. But Sharon was already moving, grabbing a clean mug. I've got it, Mrs. Shade, she said brightly. Black coffee, no sugar, right? Amy mentioned that's what you always order. Edith nodded, a little surprised, but pleased at Sharon's initiative. She watched as Sharon prepared the coffee with careful attention, then carried it to John's booth. From her position at the espresso machine, Edith couldn't hear their exchange, but she saw Sharon's animated smile, the way she gestured as she spoke. John's responses appeared minimal. He was never much of a talker with people outside his inner circle, but Edith noticed something that gave her a briefest pause. When Sharon walked away, John's eyes followed her for just a moment longer than necessary, and Sharon's smile as she returned to the counter had shifted into something Edith couldn't quite name, something that looked practiced, like a muscle memory. She's settling in okay? John asked later, as Edith brought him a refill she insisted on making herself. Wonderfully, Edith said, sliding into the booth across from him. Best hire I've made in years. The customers love her, the staff loves her, and she's got initiative. She asked if she could start opening on Sundays, said she could use the extra hours. That's good, John said, his attention seemingly on his phone. Edith studied her husband's profile, trying to remember the last time they'd had a real conversation. Their marriage had always been more partnership than passion, a practical arrangement that worked because they respected each other's boundaries. But lately, those boundaries felt less like mutual understanding and more like
distance. "You should come by more often," Edith said. "It's nice having you here." John looked up, and for a moment something soft crossed his features. "Maybe I will." That evening, as the dinner rush peaked, Edith stood at the register and watched her domain with profound satisfaction. Sharon moved between tables with balletic efficiency, somehow managing to make each customer feel like they were their only priority. Carlos called out orders in his rhythmic shorthand. Amy kept the line moving with increasing confidence. This was what she'd built. Not an empire of fear and leverage like John's world, but something more enduring. A place where people from every corner of Chicago could sit together, united by nothing more complicated than good coffee and warm cinnamon rolls. Sharon caught her eye from across the room and flashed a grateful smile, mouthing "thank you" as she balanced 3 plates on her arms. Edith smiled back, feeling that particular warmth that came from knowing she'd made a difference in someone's life. She'd given this young woman a chance, a fresh start, exactly what Sharon had asked for. As the evening light faded outside and the shop's warm glow pushed back against the Chicago darkness, Edith Shade had no idea she had just hired the instrument of her own destruction.
3 months passed like pages turning in a book Edith thought she'd already read. John's visits to the shop had changed from weekly rituals to daily habits. 4, sometimes 5 times a week now, he'd walk through that door around the same afternoon hour, his expensive suits drawing admiring glances from female customers who didn't know better than to stare at a man like John Shade. He always sat in the back corner booth, always requested Sharon. "Your husband really loves his routine," Sharon said one October afternoon, her smile as she prepared his black coffee now familiar and practiced. "Same booth, same order, same time. It's kind of sweet." Edith looked up from the inventory spreadsheet on her laptop. "He's always been a creature of habit." What she didn't say, the habit used to be once a week, not almost daily. Sharon had become indispensable in ways that made Edith proud. The young woman had volunteered for extra shifts without prompting, especially Sunday mornings when the shop operated on a skeleton crew. When Sharon mentioned she could use the additional income and loved the peaceful pace of early Sundays, Edith had given her a key without hesitation. "You've earned it," Edith had said, pressing the brass key into Sharon's palm. "I trust you completely." The gratitude in Sharon's eyes had seemed genuine. But last Sunday, when Edith stopped by in the afternoon to grab some paperwork, she'd found Sharon descending the stairs from the office, her cheeks flushed and her honey blonde hair slightly mussed. "Mrs. Shade," Sharon had pressed a hand to her chest, "I didn't expect you today." "Just needed to pick up some invoices," Edith said, studying the younger woman's face. "Everything okay?" "Oh, yes, absolutely." Sharon gestured vaguely upward. "I was organizing the inventory room. It was a mess up there, boxes everywhere. Thought I'd tackle it while things were slow." Edith had glanced toward the stairs, then back at Sharon's flushed complexion. "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." "Of course. Anything I can do to help." Sharon had squeezed past her, leaving a trail of perfume that seemed too expensive for someone claiming to need extra shifts. At home, John had become a ghost who occasionally inhabited their bedroom. He took phone calls at midnight, disappeared for entire evenings with vague explanations about business in Cicero or meetings with the Southside crew. When Edith tried to initiate conversation over dinner, his responses came in monosyllables, his attention always somewhere else. "Everything all right?" she'd asked 2 nights ago. "Fine," he'd said, not looking up from his phone, "just dealing with some complications." Complications. Everything in John's world was complications. Edith told herself this was normal. The Mafia didn't keep business hours. John always operated in shadows and late-night phone calls. This wasn't different. It couldn't be different. But Tuesday morning, as Carlos steamed milk for a cappuccino, he'd made an observation that lodged itself in Edith's chest like a splinter. "Boss sure has taken a liking to the new girl's coffee," he said, his tone casual but his dark eyes meaningful. Edith forced a laugh. "He's particular about his coffee. You know John." Carlos had simply nodded, but the look he gave her contained something uncomfortably close to pity. That night,
Edith lay awake in the king-sized bed she shared with her husband, listening to his steady breathing beside her. Physically, he was inches away. Emotionally, he might as well have been in another country. She thought about Sharon's flushed face, John's increased visits, the way his eyes tracked the younger woman across the shop floor with something that looked less like casual observation and more like focused attention. She thought about Maria Castellano's whispered warnings at last month's charity gala, warnings Edith had laughed off as gossip from a woman with too much time and too much wine. Beside her, John shifted in his sleep, unconsciously moving away from her warmth. Edith stared at the ceiling, feeling the first real tremor of doubt crack through 12 years of carefully maintained denial.
The crystal ballroom at the Peninsula Hotel glittered like something out of a dream that cost $10,000 a plate. Edith smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, Tom Ford, selected specifically because the color made John's associates' wives murmur with envy, and smiled at Patricia DeMarco's story about her daughter's acceptance to Northwestern. Around them, Chicago's elites circulated like elegant sharks. Politicians who'd been bought, judges who knew better than to ask questions, and the wives who held it all together with champagne flutes and carefully applied lipstick. This was the performance. The charity gala for children's literacy, hosted annually by the Castellano family, where blood money was laundered through good intentions and everyone pretended the men in expensive suits hadn't ordered executions between courses. Edith had perfected her role over 12 years. Gracious smile, thoughtful questions, never too loud, never too quiet. The respectable wife of John Shade, who ran a legitimate business and asked no uncomfortable questions. "Edith, darling," Maria Castellano materialized at her elbow, diamonds catching the chandelier light. "Walk with me?" It wasn't a request. Maria guided her away from the cluster of wives toward a quieter corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. At 53, Maria Castellano had survived 3 decades as an underboss's wife by knowing when to speak and when to listen. Right now, her expression suggested speaking was necessary. "I need to tell you something," Maria said quietly, her manicured hand resting on Edith's arm. "That waitress of yours, Sharon." Edith's stomach tightened. "What about her?" "She's been seen getting into John's car, multiple times, at night." Maria's voice was gentle but firm. "Outside that bar on Holstead, coming out of that restaurant in River North. Luciano's driver mentioned it to Vincent, and Vincent told Michael." The words landed like blows, but Edith's defenses rose automatically. "John gives her rides home sometimes. She lives in Inglewood. It's not safe for a young woman alone." "At 11 at night? After she's already finished her shift at your shop?" "He's protecting her, that's all." Maria's eyes softened with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "I hope you're right, Edith. I truly do." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But in our world, appearances matter, and people are starting to talk. The wives notice, the men notice. If there's something happening—" "There isn't," Edith said, her voice sharper than intended. "Then make sure everyone knows that, because once the whispers start, they don't stop, and a man who can't control his personal life looks weak. Weakness gets people killed in our world." Across the ballroom, John stood with Vincent Moretti and Robert Kane, his laugh carrying over the orchestra. He looked powerful, untouchable, exactly like the man who'd promised her, 20 years ago, in a little Italian restaurant in Little Italy, that he'd never humiliate her the way his father had humiliated his mother. "I would never do that to you," he'd said, his young face earnest. "You'd have my respect, always." Edith watched him now, watched the way he commanded the room without effort, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Maria disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Edith alone with her reflection in the dark windows and the terrible, creeping certainty that denial was no longer possible. It was time to pay attention. Sleep had abandoned Edith somewhere around 3 in the morning, leaving her staring at the ceiling while John's breathing filled the darkness beside her. At 5:15, she gave up. She dressed silently in jeans and a sweater, her movements careful not to wake her husband. In the kitchen, she scrawled a note. Couldn't sleep, gone to the shop early, and left it on the counter where John would find it if he cared to look. The drive downtown at 5:30 was like traveling through a city that hadn't yet decided to wake up. Michigan Avenue stretched empty and clean, the streetlights casting orange pools on pavement still damp from overnight rain. A garbage truck rumbled past. A homeless man pushed a shopping cart. Chicago in its most honest hour before it put on its daytime face. Edith had told herself she was going to catch up on paperwork, maybe surprise John if he was actually there handling business like he'd mentioned last night. Maybe prove Maria Castellano wrong and silence the whispers that had burrowed into her brain like parasites. But when she turned into the alley behind Edith Sprue, her hands tightened on the steering wheel. John's black Mercedes sat in the shadows, its engine cold. The shop was dark, but the office window above glowed with soft light. Edith's heartbeat filled her ears as she parked and approached the back door. Her keys felt foreign in her trembling hands. The lock clicked too loud in the pre-dawn silence. Inside, the shop smelled like yesterday's coffee and cinnamon. She stood in the darkness, listening. No voices, no movement, just the hum of refrigerators and her own ragged breathing. The stairs creaked under her feet. Each step felt like walking toward an execution, her own or someone else's, she couldn't tell. The office door was locked from the inside. Edith stared at the brass handle, part of her wanting to turn around to preserve whatever remained of her carefully constructed ignorance. But Maria's pitying eyes haunted her, Carlos's meaningful look, Sharon's flushed face descending these same stairs. She pulled out her spare key, the one she'd had made when she first bought this building, before John, before any of this, and slid it into the lock. The door swung open to emptiness. But emptiness that screamed with evidence. The leather couch held warmth that didn't belong to furniture alone. On the armrest, a coral lipstick stain caught the lamplight, the exact shade Sharon wore religiously, that bright color she claimed made her feel confident. In the trash can beside her desk, a champagne bottle, Veuve Clicquot. John had sworn off alcohol after his brother Marco died in a drunk driving accident 8 years ago, had held Edith's hand at the funeral, and promised he'd never touch it again. The air carried perfume, not Edith's subtle Chanel, something sweeter, younger, the scent Sharon left trailing through the shop like breadcrumbs. Under the desk, winking in the lamplight, a small silver earring. Edith picked it up, recognizing it immediately. Sharon had worn them last shift, little hoops she'd said were a gift from her grandmother. Edith sank to the floor, her back against the desk where she signed paychecks and paid invoices and built something that was supposed to be hers alone. The tears came silently. Not sobbing, she was too numb for that. Just water leaking from her eyes while her mind calculated with brutal precision. How many Sunday mornings? How many late-night inventory sessions? How many times had they used her space, her business, her trust as the stage for this betrayal? Above her coffee shop, in the office where she'd planned menus and hired staff and dreamed of expansion. Her phone buzzed. "John, where are you?" Edith stared at the message, then at the lipstick stain, then at the champagne bottle. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood, smoothed her jeans, and locked the office behind her with steady hands. She descended the stairs, turned on all the lights, and began the opening routine with mechanical precision. Coffee beans into the grinder, water into the espresso machine, cinnamon rolls from the freezer into the oven. Her face in the reflection of the pastry case was a perfect mask, calm, composed, the gracious owner of Edith Sprue. But inside, something cold and calculating had awakened. Inside, Edith Shade was done being merciful. Edith said nothing. For 3 days, she moved through her life like a woman underwater, present but separated, watching everything through a thick, distorting lens that made familiar things suddenly clear. She watched Sharon lean across John's table Wednesday afternoon, her body angled to display the curve of her neck, her laugh too bright for whatever he'd said. She watched John's hand brush Sharon's fingers when the younger woman set down his coffee, a touch that lasted half a second too long. She watched them take their breaks within minutes of each other, Sharon slipping out the back door, John following 5 minutes later with his phone pressed to his ear. She watched Sharon smile when she thought no one was looking, not the warm, grateful expression she wore for customers, but something else, something smug and victorious. "Everything okay?" Carlos asked Thursday morning, his weathered hands steady on the espresso portafilter. "Perfect," Edith said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Why do you ask?" He studied her face, then simply nodded. Carlos had survived 52 years by knowing when not to push. At home, John had grown restless. He kept trying to engage her in conversation, asking about her day, commenting on the weather, mentioning some restaurant they should try. His questions came with an undercurrent of nervousness, like a man who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. "You've been quiet," he said Wednesday night over dinner neither of them touched. "I've been thinking," Edith replied, her tone pleasant and empty. "About what?" "Business, the shop, normal things." He'd watched her across the table, his instincts clearly signaling that something had shifted, but unable to pinpoint what. Edith had given him nothing. No accusations, no tears, no dramatic confrontations. Just polite distance. Sharon had grown bolder. She laughed louder at John's booth, took longer breaks, wore lower necklines. Thursday afternoon, Edith went to the storage room for napkins and heard Sharon's voice through the thin wall, phone pressed to her ear. "Trust me, she has no idea," Sharon said, her Georgia accent less pronounced when she thought she was alone. "He's just being careful, but he'll leave her eventually. He said their marriage has been over for years. I just have to be patient." Edith stood frozen, napkins forgotten, listening to this young woman discuss the dismantling of her life with the casual confidence of someone who'd already won. She quietly backed out of the storage room and returned to the counter. That evening, after the dinner rush, Edith made her phone calls. "Vincent," she said when John's most loyal captain answered, "I need you at the shop Thursday night after closing, 9 o'clock. "Everything all right, Mrs. Shade?" "Family meeting. It's important." She called Robert Kane next, then Thomas DeMarco, each conversation brief, each summons accepted without question. In John's world, when the boss's wife called a family meeting, you attended. Friday morning, Edith found Sharon restocking sugar packets. "Sharon, could you stay late tonight after closing?" Edith's voice was warm, maternal. "I'd like to discuss your performance. You've been with us 6 months now. Time for a review." Sharon's face lit up. "Of course, Mrs. Shade, I'd love that." "Wonderful," Edith said, her smile perfect. "We'll talk around 9. There are some things I think we need to address directly." That evening, after the dinner rush, Edith locked the shop doors and flipped the sign to closed. She felt remarkably calm. The anger had crystallized into something colder, sharper, something that knew exactly what it was doing. At 9 o'clock, Edith's brew looked like a stage waiting for its final act. Chairs sat upended on tables, their legs pointing toward the pressed tin ceiling. The espresso machine gleamed silent. Outside, Chicago's Thursday night traffic hummed past windows that reflected the interior like a fishbowl. Everyone inside visible to the performance Edith had orchestrated. Vincent Moretti arrived first, 60 years old, with silver hair and the kind of face that had seen everything twice. He nodded to Edith, his confusion evident, but his respect for her preventing questions. Robert Kane came next, younger at 42, his expensive watch catching the light as he glanced around the empty shop. Then Thomas DeMarco, who'd known John since they were teenagers running numbers in Bridgeport. Sharon sat at a corner table, her phone clutched in manicured hands, her earlier confidence visibly cracking. She'd worn the coral lipstick, the silver earrings. John arrived last. He walked through the door and stopped, his instincts finally catching up to reality. His eyes traveled from his 3 most trusted men to Sharon to his wife standing behind the counter like a queen on a throne she'd built herself. "Edith," he said carefully, "what's this about?"
Sit down, John." Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "Gentlemen, please, find somewhere comfortable." The men exchanged glances but obeyed. In their world, when a boss's wife spoke with that particular tone, you listened. Edith placed her hands flat on the counter she'd installed 12 years ago with money she'd earned before the shade meant anything to her. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I've called you here as witnesses to something that affects not just my marriage, but the respect and stability of this family." "Edith," John started. She held up one hand. He fell silent. "In our world," she continued, her eyes moving across each face, "family is everything. Loyalty is everything. Respect is the currency that keeps us alive." She paused. "For 6 months, I've employed Sharon Barnes. I gave her opportunities, trusted her with keys to my business, praised her dedication." Sharon's face had gone pale. "What I didn't know, what I was too trusting to see, was that those extra shifts I praised her for, those Sunday mornings when she opened alone, were being spent in my office, with my husband." The room went still. Edith reached under the counter and pulled out the champagne bottle, the coral-stained napkin she'd preserved, the small silver earring. She laid them out like evidence in a trial. The lipstick stain on my office couch, the champagne, which John swore he'd never touch again after Marco died, the earring I found under my desk. She looked at Maria Moretti. "Your wife tried to warn me, Vincent. Sharon's been seen getting into John's car multiple times, late at night." Vincent's expression darkened. "My husband," Edith said, her voice never rising, "has been having an affair with my employee, in my business, above my shop, on the desk where I sign her paychecks and plan my inventory, and built something that was supposed to be mine." The silence was suffocating. Sharon broke first. He pursued me. I didn't. Mrs. Shade, he said his marriage was over. He said—" "Enough." John's voice cracked like a whip. But Vincent Moretti was already shaking his head, his weathered face carved with disappointment. "Boss," he said quietly, "this is a problem, a big problem." In their world, this wasn't just infidelity. This was weakness, loss of control. A man who couldn't keep his personal life in order couldn't be trusted to keep the family in order. Robert Kane wouldn't meet John's eyes. Thomas DeMarco stared at his hands. Edith watched her husband's carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. "I built this place," she said, her voice carrying across the shop, "before I ever knew the Shade name. It's mine. Sharon, you're fired. I want you out of Chicago. If you're still here next week, I can't guarantee your safety, not from me, but from people who don't appreciate disrespect." Sharon's chair scraped back. She grabbed her purse, her face streaked with tears and rage, and ran for the door. Edith looked at the 3 captains. "Thank you for coming. You're dismissed." They filed out silently, leaving John standing alone in the middle of the shop, surrounded by upturned chairs and the ruins of his reputation.
1 month later, winter had arrived in Chicago with its usual brutality, coating Michigan Avenue in ice and stripping the trees bare. Sharon Barnes was gone. The rumors said Atlanta, though some claimed Miami, others Los Angeles. It didn't matter. She'd vanished from Chicago like smoke, leaving behind only whispered stories and a cautionary tale about ambition that reached too high. John's empire hadn't collapsed, but it had cracked. His captains still followed orders, still showed up for meetings, still ran their operations with ruthless efficiency. But the whispers were constant, spreading through the organization like rot. Can't even control his own house. Let his wife humiliate him publicly? What kind of boss lets that happen? The Calabrese family on the South Side had started testing boundaries, encroaching on Shade territory in small, deliberate ways. Nothing dramatic enough to start a war, but enough to signal they'd noticed the weakness. John had tried to apologize multiple times. Flowers appeared at the house, a diamond bracelet left on her pillow. Once, at 2 a.m, he'd knocked on the guest room door where Edith now slept and asked if they could talk. She'd answered every attempt with the same cool politeness she'd use with a stranger. "Thank you for the flowers. The bracelet is lovely." It's late. We should both get some sleep. She hadn't filed for divorce, but they lived as ghosts in the same house, their marriage reduced to logistics and careful choreography to avoid meaningful contact. The shop, perversely, thrived. The story had spread through Chicago's interconnected networks of mob families, socialites, and curious civilians. Women came specifically to see Edith Shade, the woman who'd exposed her husband's affair in front of his own men and emerged victorious. They ordered lattes and whispered to their friends, treating Edith's brew like a pilgrimage site. Edith had become something she never sought, a legend. Tuesday morning, John walked through the door at his old time. The conversation in the shop didn't stop exactly, but it quieted, everyone suddenly aware of the drama playing out in real time. John approached the counter. "Black coffee," he said. Edith made it herself, her movements precise and professional. She set the cup down without meeting his eyes. John stood there, not moving toward his old booth. "How long will you punish me?" She looked at him then, really looked at him. He appeared older somehow, the weight of his diminished authority visible in the set of his shoulders. "I'm not punishing you, John," she said quietly. "I'm just done pretending." He opened his mouth, closed it, then carried his coffee to a different booth, not the back corner. That space belonged to someone else now. Later that week, Maria Castellano and Patricia DeMarco came in for lunch, their presence a statement. They embraced Edith warmly, their loyalty publicly declared. Other mob wives followed, women who'd spent years playing supporting roles, suddenly seeing in Edith a different kind of power. Vincent Moretti stopped by Friday afternoon, waiting until the shop was quiet. He ordered an espresso and lingered at the counter. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice low enough that only Edith could hear. "A man who can't honor his wife can't lead. The men know it, even if John doesn't want to admit it." Edith simply nodded. What else was there to say? That night, after Carlos and Amy had gone home and the last customer had departed, Edith locked the door and stood in the center of her shop, the space she'd built with her own money, her own vision, before John Shade was anything more than a handsome man with dangerous eyes. She poured herself an espresso, something she rarely did anymore, and sat in the back corner booth, John's old spot. The leather was cold. The view from this angle showed her entire domain. The counter she'd installed, the menu board she designed, the community she created, where Chicago's disparate worlds could coexist over coffee and conversation. Some marriages, she'd learned, survived on love, others on partnership. Hers had survived on mutual respect, the unspoken agreement that they'd honor each other's spaces, each other's dignity. When John broke that agreement, when he brought his betrayal into her sanctuary and laid it on her desk like an insult, he destroyed something that couldn't be rebuilt. Edith sipped her espresso, feeling its bitterness and warmth. She didn't cry. She was past that now. Outside, Chicago continued its relentless motion, cars rushing past, people hurrying through the cold, the city indifferent to personal tragedies and small revenges. Inside, Edith Shade sat in the ruins of her marriage and the triumph of her business, uncertain of what came next, but absolutely certain of one thing. The truth hadn't just freed her, it was her revenge. 2 years later, Edith's brew had expanded to 3 locations. The divorce papers finally went through 6 months ago. John's organization never fully recovered. Some damage becomes permanent. Sharon never returned to Chicago. On a quiet Thursday, Edith reviewed applications for a new hire. A young woman's resume mentioned relocating after a difficult situation. Edith paused, remembering her own naive compassion 2 years ago. She'd schedule the interview, but this time she'd watch. This time trust would be earned, not given. Some lessons cost too much to ever forget. The real lesson is that betrayal always leaves clues. Edith's mistake wasn't trusting, it was ignoring her instincts when the red flags appeared. Remember to always trust your gut when something feels wrong. Your boundaries are non-negotiable. What you build yourself can never be taken, and the truth is the strongest weapon you have.
Now, let me ask you, have you ignored red flags in a relationship, and what would you have done in Edith's position? Comment your story below. Like if this hit home. Share with someone who needs to hear this. The truth might hurt, but living a lie hurts more. Choose your peace, always.